It's fitting this weekend as we celebrate Mother's Day that we hear of the Christian imperative, that command from Christ himself: love one another. It's fitting we celebrate our mothers as we read these readings from Scripture today, because our mothers are the source of each of our own experience of love in our lives. And all of this is rooted in that simple fact that each and every one of us has a mother. We each have that person who conceived us in her womb, who carried us for 9 months and gave our bodies nourishment so that we would be prepared to enter into the world. And she endured the pains of labor so that we could continue to flourish and grow into the people we are today. Now, each and every step of this very natural process is saturated with love. The very same love that Christ speaks about today, for Christ speaks about our divine parent, who also conceived us in his mind at the very moment he decided to create the universe so many millions of years ago, who has carried us in his divine womb, as it were, by guiding all of creation through eternal divine providence. And despite all the reasons why each and every one of us should not be alive, just think about all the wars, all the diseases, the famines, the accidents, the so forth and so on through all the millennia. Somehow your parents and their parents and their parents all survived so that they could come together, so that each and every one of us could be conceived and born. This itself is a miracle. And so it is that God has guided all things to ensure that each of us would be prepared for that moment when he breathed life into us and imparted into our flesh an immortal soul. And as our mothers gave birth to us and nurtured us to the point where we are today, so God has given birth to each and every one of us as we fled the darkness of sin and death and passed through the womb of the baptismal font. The baptismal font we recounted today with that great sprinkling rite, when for the rest of eternity we are known as sons and daughters of God the Almighty. And what we see when we look at the similarities between our mothers and our God is that in both cases, none of us could be here today without either one. And all of this takes place by us doing absolutely nothing to merit what they gave us. Both God and our own mothers simply gave. Quite frankly, this is ultimately the simplest and best definition for love that Christ is speaking about today in our gospel. Loving is giving. And when we speak about love in the proper sense, as Christ speaks about it, we speak in the sense of giving ourselves. What Christ is trying to teach us is the simplest of all teachings, that love is about the other person. And since love is about the other person and giving to the other, love always necessitates two people who give themselves to each other completely. Now, obviously, this is most seen perhaps and exemplified in our world today within that holy bond of marriage, when a man and woman are able to not only share feelings and emotions, but express their feelings by physically giving themselves completely to that other person, while at the same time being completely vulnerable as they open themselves up to receive everything that their spouse is giving to them, unconditionally, without limitation, without counting the cost. Both spouses become like all of us once were when we were babies in our mother's wombs, completely dependent on each other to nourish, protect, and sustain each other as one flesh, the one flesh that they become in that holy sacrament of marriage. Now, obviously, we don't need to be married in order to love. Christ himself tells us that friendship is itself participation in this great outpouring of self that we call love. So much love are we to have for our friends that we ought to be even willing to die for them if there is to be a choice between themselves and us, which is the epitome of what it means to give yourself for another. Love is further exemplified in service to Christ's body, the church, when the ordained and the consecrated religious, like any bride or groom, marry themselves to the divine bridegroom, pledging to give themselves entirely to God and his body, the church, as to receive from him his love in return in great abundance, enabling them to remain in his great love forever. Now, the sad reality is, however, that love is greatly misunderstood, misinterpreted, or flat out rejected in our world today, which seeks only joy. But joy cannot be separated from love. For love is how we get to joy. It's how we achieve the joy that we all desire. Christ himself said in our gospel today, "I have told you this so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete." Our purpose for existing is not to love. Rather, love is the means, is the way in which we get to enjoyment. And if we understand what joy is, we might better understand what Christ is talking about and why it's necessary for us to love God, his commandments, our neighbor, his church, in order to receive it. In its simplest terms, its simplest definition, joy is resting. Being at rest in that which we seek and desire, that brings us ultimate happiness and fulfillment. We say resting because once you have it, you never want to get rid of it. Think of a toddler. When they get attached to that favorite stuffed animal or blankie, they never want to part with it because it brings them that sense of happiness that they desire. And as many of you parents can attest to, there is nothing, even if that blankie is shreds of what it used to be, nothing that can serve as a fitting substitute. And for us who have come to know God and to have drawn ourselves into that company with him, first through baptism, even deeper through confirmation, and fully initiated in the great gift of the Blessed Sacrament, the thing we ought to want more than anything itself, what ought to drive our desires, God himself. And when we achieve it, when we receive him, we desire to enjoy him for all eternity. But we can't get there if we cannot first love, if we cannot give ourselves freely, fully to God, but of course also to our neighbor. Loving is how we get to joy. There are no shortcuts. That is why Christ says, "Keep my commandments." Because it is impossible to achieve the heavenly union with God for the purpose of achieving joy if we cannot first love him as he has loved us. God's commandments do not tell us how to love, but they do tell us that by violating them, it is in fact impossible to love as we ought. If we hope to attain the goal of eternal joy with God, we can never do it in violation of the commandments. And therefore, we think back to our own mother on this Mother's Day weekend, as we see that she, like God, loved us, pouring herself out for each and every one of us so that we might exist, have life in this world. But we can surely see that, like God, our moms require us to persevere in this relationship of love in order for it to grow, to be fulfilled, so that we might enjoy that relationship as it should be. For just as we have conditions in our relationship with God, so too do we have conditions in our human relationships, even with our mothers. And if we violate any of these conditions, if we violate that bond of love that has been given to us, we damage our ability to be able to enjoy that relationship, that life that we are called to. Jesus says, keep my commandments and remain in my love, so that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. Our joy is in heaven. God's love is how we get there. Use this Mother's Day weekend to reflect on the love that He has been given to all of you, and how to use that gift that's been passed on. It's ingrained in our very being, as how to use that to draw closer and closer to God, where with joy He anticipates your very arrival into His eternal dwelling, to rejoice with Him forever.